Before starting any new campaign with a new system, one of the first things to think about, and think about seriously, is the level of competence given to the player characters. Where do they rate in the setting in terms of their competence? Is this a game where we begin at the bottom rung of competence and we're expected to climb our way up the ladder? Or are we starting somewhere in the middle? Or are we starting right at the very top? There are very few games that actually start you off at the top. Star Trek Adventures might be one of those. After all, the improvement system in Star Trek Adventures really does not focus on the character getting better. It focuses on the character changing or being responsible for different things over time. It also allows the player to cause changes in the supporting cast around their characters. So, what does that mean, that these are highly competent characters? On a very fundamental level, we're talking about what success and failure really means. In this game, what does it mean to fail a task? I've had some conversations inside the group that is playing Star Trek Adventures First Response with me, and so I thought it might be a good idea to share. Failure was also recently a topic at Adept Play, talking about the nature of failure in different games. So, in Star Trek Adventures, when you're asked to make a roll, one of the things that you're advised to do is make sure that the players know what the difficulty is up front. They know what type of roll it is, so that they know what's required of them to do, and they can apply whatever talents or other abilities they might have that is pertinent to that type of roll. But of prime importance, they can assess from the beginning how difficult it will be to attempt the task, which means once they know the difficulty, they can back away from the task. Not after they've rolled, but when they know what the difficulty is, they can assess whether or not it's wise to go ahead under current conditions with that task. They may need to recruit allies to assist them. They may need to obtain or create some sort of tool to help them, or whatever. Which suggests that the characters are fairly aware of what the consequences of failure might be. Now, we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about roles, but we do want to set them up fairly, and the term we often use for this is framing of roles. So we need to be specific. If you roll, this is what you're rolling for. This is the difficulty you're rolling against. The player will then decide if that's actually what they want to do, and if that difficulty is something that they want to risk, or if some change somewhere needs to be made. Well, let's say we go through all of that and we bring all of our different resources to bear and yet still fail. What does that mean? This is not a new topic. Often we find during the course of learning how to be role-playing game players, we have that phase where failure means humor, and the source of humor is the character. So failure becomes something stupid, something funny, something ridiculous that the character caused to happen. Right? And depending on the group, this will be more extreme. It could be something from like falling down to some sort of wardrobe failure or whatever. It might be quite extreme, like the tool you're using breaking, or injury to oneself. So sometimes we can conflate, we can confuse failure with critical failure if the game includes it, or even if it doesn't. It can be dragged in from some other game, right? Even if that's not really a part of the game that you're playing now. So failure is a matter of some importance as a part of buying into and presenting and representing the game that you're actually playing now. So what does it mean for Starfleet officers to fail? If you've been watching First Response, there have been quite a few failed rolls, flat out failed. And yet it will probably seem to viewers like there really weren't negative consequences that followed along with that, which is not exactly true. The difficulty, I find, is in remembering who the character is, what their training is, how well trained they are, how much they understand the task that's being attempted. But it's also in the actual framing. What was stated as the goal? If I'm successful, what will I get? Right. So it could be something like plotting a course. Right. I would like to plot a course. Now we could take it that someone assigned to a starship will not be rolling to plot a course from point A to point B. Right. They're not going to be rolling for that. But if they're seeking to gain some advantage, a faster course, a more elusive course, a course that maximizes their potential to detect something along the neutral zone or something along those lines without being detected themselves, then we're looking for something above and beyond, right? So if failure doesn't mean that no course was plotted, failure means that that advantage that they were going for is not met. Right? They don't fail at their basic job. They don't fall out of their seat. They don't crash the ship. They are unable, in this moment, with the tools that were available to them, to gain that advantage. That advantage proved to be unattainable. Maybe just for them, maybe another character around could attempt it, but these people are highly trained. And the game casts second attempts as requiring a change of situation and a change of difficulty. So it recognizes the role that was made. And if we're going to try it again, we have to approach it in a different way because that first way didn't work. And it will be harder, obviously, because we've already brought our best to bear and not succeeded. So this makes good sense. So failure means that the stated goal, the frame for that task, was not met. It doesn't lead to some other complication. Now, in the game, how do we get to those other complications? That's if we roll a 20 or within an expanded range for complication, which could be as low as 16. This, again, doesn't mean failure. It just means complication. So you can have complications on success. So that's kind of interesting as well. This doesn't also mean that the game leans toward success. That's a factor of how difficult the tasks are that are being attempted, that are opened up for rolls. So if we're successful, we can manipulate that success when relevant by using any momentum that we happen to generate or that might already be banked in the momentum pool. And we can do things like ask the game master for more information about the situation. We can spend momentum to get more information, deepening the success of the roll. Or we can create some kind of advantage. Knowing what we know now, having reached this level of success, we can try to make some future task easier. Right? Or likewise, we can make things more difficult for the opposition to make failure more likely on their end. So interesting uses of momentum. Something that hasn't appeared in First Response yet is success at cost. And I have been hesitant about when I would introduce it, like if I would introduce it right away, such as in the very first roll of the campaign. I found myself thinking, is this the appropriate moment to bring in success at cost? Or will this have me talking too much right here in the beginning on this first roll? And I opted not to introduce success at cost. I just made it a simple failure to demonstrate this very concept. What does failure mean in this game? Does it mean that Ensign Yang is unable to use the computer system to get a report to his captain? No. It meant that he was unable to parse through all of the details and give a better report than had already been given. That's the task that was framed, right? Ensign, make sure the ship is ready for travel. The report says the ship was ready for travel. Success on that role would have been identifying those things which the captain should probably know about. The role was failed. The ensign was unable to discern this information from among all the things that he needed to scan through. So, what is a failure? The inability to complete the task. What is the reason? There are environmental factors outside the character which would naturally, logically lead to the thing failing. There are, of course, internal elements such as stress, worry, injury, distraction, that might lead a character to fail. And as players, part of the collaboration, part of the improvisation, the interaction, is finding the right note, finding the right detail that makes this failure make sense. It isn't always that the character who received the role screwed up. They may have done everything right. It just may not have been possible. The dice are just simply telling you that the task was not successful. Why not is in the hands of the people who get to describe it. In this game, that's the game master to detail why this task was not carried out successfully. Success at cost allows you to change a situation which really should not be able to fail completely, right? Such as a navigation check like we were talking about earlier, and to allow it to succeed at cost. You can find these rules on page 83. It's in chapter 4. It says, though the task has technically been successful, one of the things that part of the cost is that momentum cannot now be spent to improve the outcome. So that's particularly interesting. But also a complication is going to be assigned. So let's look at that opening scene with Ensign Yang, where he's asked to go through this report and notify the captain of anything of which he should be aware. I did introduce a complication. I did not talk about it at the time. I introduced it later, which was good for drama, not particularly good in terms of presenting success at cost. But what we end up with is that the Avicenna was in refit, and it had been described quite thoroughly that systems were being reorganized and different parts of the ship were being prepared for pretty significant changes, from being a warship to being a crisis response vessel, pushed more toward medical emergencies and that sort of thing. So there were some problems with the weapons systems. Phasers worked. Photon torpedo systems worked. Sensor systems worked. Deflector shields worked. All of these things worked. However, the tie-ins between them weren't functioning properly. So while the ship could defend itself with its screens, it was not able to track enemy targets and fire on them effectively. This is a huge problem if you're heading into battle. Now, the original assessment, this was baked in as having been missed. On a difficulty 0 roll, we might expect Ensign Yang to be able to find this important detail, and it would have been included in basic success had he done so. He failed, and this becomes pretty interesting. Making it success at cost, I would have told him about it. he wouldn't be able to get more information about it, and he would suffer a personal complication, such as embarrassment. I might deduct stress in that scene. I might give him some kind of temporary reputation among the crew to deal with. Right? These are the types of options you have available to you. Instead, I kept it to myself about the weapon system and allowed that to become relevant later. With this crew now that we have a grounding in the rules, this is not something I will do again. We're now ready for this layer of success and failure to be brought in, right? Because we're not explaining other things anymore. And I think it's important to consider the rule set in terms of all of the things that you're going to be doing with it from the learning perspective of when are you going to introduce parts of it. Which parts do you consider to be essential, and which parts can be phased in later, right? So that you can learn while playing and use that playtime effectively or efficiently, not stopping for every single instance of the rules. So that over the course of several sessions, you will introduce major rules and minor rules that function together nicely, and layer on more and more until you're playing the full game. I find that to be my comfort zone with bringing these things to light. So in this video, what we've been talking about is assessing the rules for success and failure, which begins with understanding how competent the characters are, what that means in terms of framing the roles, which leads into how difficult that task happens to be, which then means we need to consider what does failure mean? What are possible sources of failure from that task or for that task? What, if any, consequences or complications might arise as a result of failure? Is this the type of task that is suitable for success at cost? Or is it one that should just simply be allowed to fail and be done? So, failure in Star Trek Adventures is a pretty interesting animal. We begin with the understanding that the characters are extremely competent, so the source of their failure will very rarely be them. And when it is them, that is perhaps the fuel for much of what occurs in that episode. What's going on with that character and why? We can explore it. So, anyway, I hope this discussion of failure has been helpful. If you have more to add, or if you have questions about what I'm talking about, or different examples from actual play of your own or from First Response, contact me in the comments. Take care.